Hello there, dog lovers. I've got the ultimate guide today to canine anxiety to help you and your reactive dog. So grab a drink and a snack as I take you through all the important points about anxiety. We're going to think about what it is, what it's not, what it looks like, and we'll also start to pull out some of the important parts of helping your dog move from a reactive life to an adaptive life. In the last video, I took you through 10 different reasons that dogs can be reactive, and you'll find a link to that in the description below. But you'll also know that a few dogs only have one simple reason for their responses. Often it's multiple factors. But anxiety is one big one for our reactive dogs. And unless we support our dogs to overcome their anxiety, many of us will find that our dogs are unable to move on and live a more varied and fulfilling life. But what even is anxiety? Can dogs even feel anxious? If you live with a reactive dog, you don't need me to tell you that they're struggling with anxiety quite often. You're living and breathing that stuff. So believe it or not, there is actually no agreed understanding of anxiety, and some dog trainers and academics even disagree about whether dogs can feel anxious or not. So while fear is seen as like a basic emotion shared by many animals, most mammals, anxiety is often seen as a more complex emotion since it requires an ability to hold like mental images of the future. So for that reason, some people don't even like to think that dogs feel anxiety. But I'm sure if you're watching this already, you're already convinced. And we're in good company. Charles Darwin also thought that an animal's experience is similar to ours. And what he said was that although humans and animals are different species, the difference between us was one of degree and rather than kind. And what he meant was that animals feel their own kind of species-specific feelings in their own species-specific ways, but there wasn't anything substantially different between humans and animals. That dogs experience anxiety was not out of question for Charles Darwin, but the way they experienced it was perhaps different than from how humans might experience it. Despite lacking a general agreed definition, it's important to separate out anxiety from fear for many reasons, not least because anxiety can make our fear responses much quicker, much more dramatic, and they can make that response last longer. Anxiety can be thought of as an anticipatory emotion coming before it arises without any source of danger. So in other words, when we feel anxiety, we feel apprehensive about the possibility of danger in the future. There's no actual danger right there at that moment in time. So veterinary behaviourist Dr. Karen Overall says that anxiety arises as uncertainty from having incomplete information. I love that definition, it's so helpful. So what we see in these definitions are the makings of a solution. We don't have complete information and we're uncertain about the future, then giving a dog complete information is going to help them feel more certain. So when the future is predictable, when we know there's no danger, when we've got complete information, then we can expect anxiety to be reduced for us and for dogs too. So anxiety affects us at 3 levels. First, it affects our very biology, our physiology, all the chemicals that are racing through our body. So at each of these levels, we see differences between anxiety and fear. So unlike fear, which involves triggering the fight or flight mechanisms that we so often hear about, anxiety doesn't cause the same reaction in our body. And although fear and anxiety overlap, we don't expect anxiety to affect things like our heart rate, our blood pressure, the neurotransmitters and hormones that course through our body in the same way that fear does. So there's no complete activation of the fight or flight system with anxiety, although it primes our body to be ready for that. Anxiety and fear affect our emotions and cognition differently too. Anxiety is very much a cognitive emotion rather than a bodily emotion, if that makes any sense, as we're weighing up the potential for future danger. It's very much a mental process. Anxiety also affects our behaviour. Fear involves escape behaviours. This is really important. So when we feel afraid, we try to escape as we try to get away from danger or threat. But anxiety often involves avoidance behaviour. This is very different, and this is going to be really crucial later on in Lighten Up materials as we strive to help our dogs adapt more easily. It can be very difficult to place a dog in a situation where their prime instinct is to avoid the threat that they're anticipating. So physiology, emotions, cognition and behaviour are hugely intertwined and they're constantly feeding back to one another. It's not like we can separate out these categories. And what you want to know, of course, is what causes anxiety. So it's perhaps easy to think about what contributes to it because there are lots of factors. There's usually no single cause. The first thing you'll know if you're a Lighten Up follower is that genetics can contribute to anxiety. So the work of Scott and Fuller in the 1960s at Bar Harbor, and specifically the work of Otis Murphy in the 1970s in Arkansas, shows us that anxiety and tendencies towards fearfulness have many inherited components, i.e. it's genetic. Anxious parents are much more likely to have anxious offspring. But that's not perfect, genetics never is, and it's not a guarantee because it's only one single component of who dogs are. But anxious genes can contribute hugely to our dog's anxiety. The prenatal environment can also contribute to our dog's anxiety. So what that means is, in the third trimester of pregnancy in specific, stress hormones can pass through the placental barrier and they sensitise the unborn puppy so that they're much more likely to respond quickly to fearful events, and their response will be much longer and more intense. Maternal care as well in those very early weeks is also believed to contribute to welfare and how we deal with stress. So where dogs provide good care for their puppies, nurturing them, cleaning them, these activities affect how the puppy will then go on to handle stress. So neglectful mothers often have anxious offspring. Even when puppies from robust and solid litters are then fostered by neglectful mothers who don't care for and support their young in the same way, those puppies also show signs of that neglect in how they handle stress in later life. Early learning is also so important. So from the moment that puppies open their eyes around 11 days to the closing of the sensitive period some 66 days later, they just start life as curious investigators, and their worldview is formed in this time. So simple lack of familiarity with noises, with social situations, with unfamiliar surfaces, or even with novelty can cause a lifetime of damage that's very difficult to put right. That worldview that's created in this sensitive period establishes how they feel about everything that they'll later encounter. So these four things, poor genetics, stressful pregnancies, unskilled mothers or neglectful mothers, and lack of life experience, they describe almost exactly the typical puppy farm experience. So if you want a robust and happy dog who can go to the beach and the dog park with you, make sure you choose your breeder or the association you adopt from really carefully. These things are really important. Very difficult to put them right later once they've gone wrong. Those early learning experiences are consolidated as the dog ages, are cemented in. So young puppies between 5 to 14 weeks or so, and then adolescents from 9 months or so, right up until social maturity, which is some 18 to 36 months later, they're consolidating that worldview, they're confirming it. Is the world a good place or not? So when traumatic or poorly handled experiences happen at these times in particular, they're very likely to have much more of an impact than it would on a robust adult dog. So beyond this, fearful experiences, they teach us to be anxious in similar situations in the future. Where life's unpredictable and uncertain, that can make us anxious as well. So now I've thoroughly depressed you with all the things that we can't undo, all the causes, what can we do? So what I'm going to give you here is a very, very superficial and simple overview of what is undoubtedly several days worth of materials and several weeks or months worth of work. But that's the kind of thing that my clients would tend to focus on if they've got an anxious dog. So as Lighten Up evolves, all of these processes will be fully explained and exemplified. It's just too much to share with you in one go, no matter how much I really want to. So the thing that makes a lot of difference to many dogs with anxiety is to have a predictable routine. And although we need to be careful to make sure that it's not so predictable that the dog can't cope with any variation, so that it's not a crutch, turning from chaotic and unpredictable lives can make a real difference to anxious dogs. At the same time, being in a chaotic and unpredictable environment can make it very hard for them to thrive. Next up, we've got graduated exposure. So that might be to things that they're fearful of, but it basically means we'll need to expose our dogs to things in fine shavings rather than expecting them to cope with immediately. So instead of throwing them in at the deep end and expecting them to swim the channel the next day, we need to make sure we teach them how to cope with buoyancy aids first and then unaided for 5 meters and then progressively all the way up. And this is true for all aspects of an anxious dog's life. as you introduce unpredictable things, that will also need to happen in small and easy stages. So even things like changing from, we've got the ditch the bowl movement, even things like changing from a bowl at fixed times to enrichment activities using food distributors can be really stressful for an anxious dog. So even those things would need to happen in a graduated way, really, really small. So for instance, I might start with the next day I might put 95% of their food in a bowl and also a little toy with some food in it as well, and then the next day progressively 90%, 85%, and so on, so that I'm not doing it all in one great big lump, because it's that unpredictability and that chaos that can be really, really hard for dogs. But at the same time, we do need to start pushing back those barriers, because otherwise we're going to have dogs who are stuck in that routine and can't cope without the support mechanism. Giving back control to the dog is also really important, and that's true for unpleasant stuff as well. Choice is absolutely vital. So we're going to look at training as part of the Lighten Up process, training that we know as start button behaviours, and we're also going to look at cooperative care. It's also important when we're talking about anxiety to know that choice can be really stressful as well, and when we've got too many choices, sometimes that can make it really, really hard for the dog. So sometimes it's just about setting up a limited amount of choices so that they've got a couple of things to choose from, but they give the animals choice over what happens to them. So we use those graduated exposures, those thinly shaved progressive developments, the 100% to 95 to 90, right the way down to 0 over a period of time. I'm not trying to throw them in at the deep end and do it all in one go. If your dog is really struggling for prolonged periods of the day, so it's not just momentary, it's not just, a few minutes here and there, if they're panicking or if they're phobic, getting medication on board to support you won't change your dog overnight, but it will be an essential step in your work. We can be really resistant to medication which makes a huge difference to a great many dogs, and sometimes we're tending to start with supplements which are very expensive in many cases, when in actual fact medication might be more appropriate. So we do need to think of, if we've got a dog who is suffering from prolonged anxiety during the day, that this is a huge welfare issue. This is not a healthy dog, so we need to be thinking about what we can do that. If our dog were in pain, we would be thinking about adding pain medication, and the same with anxiety, that we need to be thinking about anti-anxiety medications if our dog is suffering from anxiety that seems to appear periodically throughout the day. So while we can't necessarily change how dogs feel about unpleasant things, we can turn those unpleasant things into a predictor of good things. So when a bad thing or 100% predicts a good thing, it reduces the impact of that bad thing significantly, and you will find that over time you don't need that very much at all. Just as I started recording this slide, next door's dog started barking. I've got guard dogs, they grew up in rural France, they find this really uncomfortable, it's unpleasant for them. It's a warning. It's what did they talk about Dodie Smith in 101 Dalmatians, midnight barking? To them, it's a warning that something is in the environment that they need to be paying attention to. And all I've done over time is pair those dogs barking up with praise, with biscuits, with attention, with moving away from the stressful environment and helping my dogs cope. And it doesn't make them feel any better about the dog barking next door, but as you heard, I didn't have any barking here. So these things can be really important, that we're not necessarily... That barking is never going to feel great to my dogs. They're never going to go, woohoo, next door's dog are barking. But they will know, because of predictable, where the unpleasant thing like the dog barking predicts that they will get something great, that eventually, if we do that enough and we're 100% at the beginning, we'll get, and we also periodically revisit it, which we'll talk about shortly, what we'll find is that their anxiety reduces, because all that's happening is the unpleasant thing is actually predicting a good thing will happen. So this isn't a technique though for prolonged or erratic bad things, especially related to noise sensitivity. So things like bird scaring, gas cannons, gunshot, fireworks, thunder, they're both prolonged and erratic from time to time. So it's better for single event stuff like the appearance of another dog in the distance, or the dog's barking next door, as long as it doesn't happen all day. Or even things like having their ears cleaned daily. This, where something unpleasant actually then predicts something really super pleasant, can be a really useful strategy for anxious dogs. And it's working on predictability. That's what it's doing, is all it's causing is just a very predictable pattern for our dogs. We also need to understand that our anxious dogs have a relatively fixed worldview. We're going to talk a lot about worldviews as Lighten Up on roles and belief systems, but we need to understand that there are cognitive rules, John, formed early in life from our early experience of things, and that once these rules are fixed or formed, they're pretty well cemented. Everything we do after is just learning exceptions. So for Liddy, her view of human beings is that 8 billion of them are pretty bad and 20 of them are pretty good. So her worldview is that humans are not a good thing, and everything that comes after is exception. So all we're doing with a lot of anxiety is just pushing back those exceptions where we're fighting against early worldviews. So for many reasons, relapse is probable, predictable, it's likely, but it's also avoidable if we take the right precautions and we train to avoid it. So if we're prepared for relapse, if we expect relapse as part of the program, if we never really expect them to be truly rehabilitated, in inverted commas, if we train for that and help make the exceptions into the rule, we can change our dog's view of things. One very large reason that I started Lighten Up was because much modern dog training, whether it's using rewards or punishment or balance methods, whatever they are, building relationships and choices, it's always focused on the bad stuff. It's not actually about strengthening a dog's existing skills. So even dogs who are almost completely shut down have got some existing coping skills. And we need to also teach dogs when they're safe. I've been working dogs for many years before I even came across literature that focused on learning when we're safe, but I promise you it's absolutely mind-blowing. It changed everything that I felt about how we train dogs who are reactive. So it's a little tricky for us to get our heads around at first, but it's actually really simple to teach, and you've been sharing this week all of your methods that you already have in your toolbox to help your dog to cope with these moments. We need to be thoughtful in how we're going to use them, but I'm going to tell you now that there are magic wands. There really are, and a lot of you have them already. We forget as well that dogs are a social species, and that dogs, like humans, don't function in a social vacuum. Our family, our friends, our peers, even paid professional support network, they help us cope. And the same is true for our dogs. So we're going to be looking at how we can support our dogs, but also how dogs can provide support for each other. So there's a process called co-regulation, which is essentially a graduated supportive way of working with dogs to help build up their skills to cope independently. And what it does is it passes the baton, if you like, from an individual like a human being or even another dog to help the dog build up the skills to cope independently when they're on their own. And I'm going to link you into a blog about this process and the details below, but I promise you there'll be lots more materials coming about these processes because they can be very, very useful with anxiety. So there you have it. We've got some clarification about definitions and what anxiety actually is. We've got some explanations about the causes of anxiety and a very brief overview of the roadmap out of anxiety, which will form the backbone of Lighten Up approach. Over the coming months, you'll find worksheets and guides that are going to help you unpick your dog's behaviour and help you also find the right strategies to find your way through. So much as I'd like to just dump it all on you now and say, just do this, just do that, just do this, I know that's overfacing and it's unhelpful. It's got to be specific for the dog. So it may be that for your specifically anxious dog, that only a handful of little tweaks will be necessary. We need to go slow at the beginning and understand things fully, but we will get there, I promise. So don't forget to subscribe if you want updates. Hit the subscribe button below. Lighten Up Dog Training on Facebook if you want daily tips and strategies. Sign up to my blog if you want more detailed content. And finally, share us with anyone that you think would benefit.